Alright everybody, it's time to kick off the summer by pretending it's October. This time around we're talking about Night Terrors Green Lantern #1, the Hal Jordan-centric tie-in to the current DC horror event, Night Terrors. Just a reminder that we're getting Night Terrors Green Lantern #1 this month, Night Terrors Green Lantern #2 next month, and then the main series numbering picks back up with Green Lantern #3. Since this pair of Night Terrors tie-in issues are a Hal Jordan story written by the writer of the main Green Lantern series, and it does pick up from where Green Lantern #2 left off last month, I would recommend reading it if you're planning to follow the current run of Green Lantern. But do these tie-ins contribute anything meaningful to the ongoing series? Let's get into it and find out. Night Terrors Green Lantern #1, written by Jeremy Adams, with pencils by Eduardo Pensica, inks by Julio Ferreira, colors by Luis Guerrero, and letters by Dave Sharp. This issue's title is Doorway to Death. Picking up right where Green Lantern #2 left off, everyone on the plane has fallen asleep except for Hal, who seems to be clinging to consciousness through sheer force of will. He makes his way to the cockpit only to find a funeral. But not just any funeral, this was his father's service, which was held decades ago. A blurb on the title page tells us that a villain named Insomnia has put the entire world to sleep in order to search everyone's dreams for something called the Nightmare Stone, and is twisting all of your worst fears into horrific nightmares as a result. And it hits Hal hard right away when the burned body of his father crawls out of the coffin and chases him across the room. I think it's interesting that instead of focusing on the moment of the crash, this fear is instead tied to seeing what remains of his father after it's all over. Hal runs through a doorway and ends up in the middle of another distorted vision of his own past, this time his origin story. A brief back and forth with Carol shows us that their relationship has always been the same contentious mess since the very beginning. Then Hal is rocketed away to the crash site of Abin Sur, who heals himself by draining away Hal's life force. This whole sequence is particularly interesting when you remember that these distortions are all based on Hal's deepest fears. Yes, a villain is manipulating them, but he's just reshaping what was already there. Abin Sur calls Hal weak and says that the world would never miss him if he was gone, which seems to speak directly to Hal's experiences in Green Lantern #1 and 2. But the big one is when Abin acknowledges that Hal has strong willpower, only to then say that willpower is not enough and it never has been. This is pretty huge, because not only does this scene present Hal's Green Lantern ring as something he wears in exchange for not having his life anymore, it also shows us that there's a part of Hal that knows he can't get by on just willpower alone. That filling his life with nothing but Green Lantern is ultimately self-destructive, because it introduced a single point of failure that caused him to lose everything. Again, this is a direct reflection of what happened in the last 2 issues of Green Lantern, how Hal's greatest strength has become a weakness, and now his life has fallen apart. Speaking of the last 2 issues, the next nightmare gives some context to why Hal's life changed so abruptly, but not as much as you may think. The Guardians, Kilowog, and the rest of the Green Lantern Corps are assembled in front of the Central Battery to talk about recent events on the planet Korugar that resulted in the death of a Green Lantern. Apparently, this is the dream that Insomnia took the most creative liberties with, because Hal begins to realize none of this is real when he remembers that the Guardians had already disappeared by this point, and Kilowog wasn't there. When Insomnia does show himself, he admits that Hal's been able to resist the nightmares better than most people, and he had to change things around more than normal to get the results he wanted, which is probably why this latest dream was the least accurate. The one piece of actual information we get from this scene is the fact that whatever led to Hal quitting the Corps has to do with a Green Lantern who died on the planet Korugar. Hal tries fighting Insomnia directly, but still has one more fear to deal with. The Parallax entity claws its way out of the Central Battery and lunges for Hal. This issue walks a careful line between Hal being the best there is at resisting fear, while showing us that he still has deeply rooted fears that he never got over. These nightmares are heightened versions of real fears that Hal never talks about, and those fears don't prevent him from being a great Green Lantern, but they may be what keeps him from succeeding in other aspects of his life. On some level, Hal knows that he's on the wrong path. That if all you have is your job, then losing that job will leave you with nothing, and all the willpower in the world can't force happiness or love into your life. Honestly, the biggest problem I had with this story is the blurb I mentioned earlier, because it's a pretty bad way to convey important information right up front. If you don't read one small, easy-to-miss block of text in the bottom corner of the title page, then you'll have no idea what's going on. But maybe that would be better, since Hal also doesn't know what's going on. Although Hal does get to speak directly to Insomnia near the end of the issue, so that moment could have been used to comment directly on the search for the Nightmare Stone, and reveal to both Hal and the reader all of the information in that text block in a more natural way. Now, we've also got a 10-page Sinestro backup story, written by Alex Segura, with art by Mario Fox Facillo, colors by Prasad Rao, Pressy, and letters by Dave Sharp. The title of this story is Shards from the Looking Glass Part 1. Previously, we've seen that Sinestro is hiding out on Earth, and now we have a better idea of why. Sinestro believes that falling under the control of the villain of Dark Crisis let him achieve heights he'd never been capable of before, meaning that by comparison, all of his power and ambition would never actually be good enough. As Sinestro puts it, he was a better version of himself, possibly the best version of himself, when he was a mindless puppet serving a master. That thought has sent him spiraling into depression and caused him to go into exile. At his lowest point, Insomnia's nightmare wave hits, confronting Sinestro with visions of a dead planet Korrigar, a twisted version of his best friend Abin Sur, and a version of himself from his glory days, right after he got his first yellow ring and went out on his own. Sinestro is seemingly saved by a Green Lantern version of himself, with 7 faces, 17 hands, and at least 10 extra eyes. This story is leaning into the idea that everything in Sinestro's life started going wrong after he adopted the Yellow Ring, so it makes sense to frame his prior status as a Green Lantern as an enlightened savior, complete with all the third eye imagery you could want. Again, just like with Hal, all of this is just an amplified expression of Sinestro's fears and self-doubts, and it does make sense with the internal logic of the story. But my problem is that the basis of that logic doesn't make sense. Everything we're told in this backup relies on the idea that Sinestro became a superior version of himself during Dark Crisis, when the chains of the Great Darkness subjugated him into serving as a member of the Dark Army. The infamous Death of the Justice League issue went out of its way to point out that every villain under the Big Bad's control was actually much weaker and pretty ineffectual when compared to prior battles, so I really don't know why Sinestro thinks any of this was better. Maybe it's because of how close the Dark Army came to winning. They did have a distinct advantage at first, but only because the heroes were disorganized. Once the JSA showed up and the Titans regrouped, everything changed. Though now that I think about it, he did have some kind of power upgrade in I Am Batman number 15, so maybe that had something to do with it? I don't know, nothing about what Sinestro thinks or feels in this story sits right with me. It all comes out of nowhere and reframes his experiences during Dark Crisis in a way that doesn't make sense to me after I read that whole event. Also, there's an editor's note declaring Dark Crisis to be a classic, and that's probably the biggest piece of distorted reality in this entire issue. So that's Night Terror's Green Lantern number 1. What did you think of Hal's specific fears? How do you feel about the revelation of what's going on with Sinestro? Are there any other Night Terrors books that you'd recommend? Tell me all about it in the comment section, and subscribe if you want to see the rest of this story when I cover Night Terror's Green Lantern number 2, as well as the rest of the Green Lantern ongoing series that this event feeds into. Thank you for taking the time to watch. My name is Dan. We'll talk again soon.